Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. This is Dr. David Nace, Chief Medical Officer here at Innovacer, and I'm so pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar, this joint webinar between Innovacer and Microsoft, the role of a health cloud in making decision-making in digital health initiatives. So this is very exciting. We're going to talk about the health cloud. So let's start off by introducing our guests. First of all, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jim Weinstein. Jim is the Senior Vice President for Microsoft Healthcare and the former President and CEO of Dartmouth Health System and the Director of the Dartmouth Institute. Jim, welcome.
Hey, great to be with you, David. Thanks.
And also, our other esteemed guest, Dr. Glenn Steele, who has been most recently Vice Chair of the Healthcare Transformation Alliance and is the former President and CEO of Geisinger Health System and also an advisor to us here at Innovacer. Glenn, welcome.
Good to be with you both.
Great, and so let's go ahead and get started into this discussion. So let me start this off with the two of you as this panel-driven discussion to say, you know, we talked about data for a long time in healthcare. Data has really been a big issue in other industries. We've talked about it as a promise in healthcare. And back in 2009, during the Great Recession, we enacted this HITECH Act to spend more than $25 billion digitalizing healthcare. So I have a question for both of you. How did that work out? What was achieved and what wasn't achieved? Let's start with you, Glenn.
Well, I think it was an important first step. And thinking about my time at Geisinger, we couldn't have done what we were able to do without having an electronic infrastructure. We were, you know, in 46 counties and then eventually 3 states. We couldn't have had a standardized approach to patient care. We couldn't have innovated. We couldn't have actually even had an effective brand without having an electronic infrastructure and the EHR and the decision to nationalize that and scale it was critical, but it had huge limitations. Obviously, it was adequate for documenting services. It was adequate for exchanging information to some extent. It was certainly designed around reimbursement and revenue cycle, not around giving care. But I saw it as a start, and we're probably now in the 3rd or 4th phase of generating beyond electronic health record, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Jim, how about your perspective?
Yeah, I think I concur with Glenn. I think it was interesting to think that, 12 years ago, when that happened, compared to where we are today. So I think there's been monumental change because of it. It's interesting that Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act is an interesting name because the economics of that have not quite worked out, but I think they will. Did we have some misses with interoperability and things like that today is really important? Yes, we did. Probably cost more than we wanted. It's like 23 billion, turned out to be 36 billion. Not sure the penalties, actually made the difference. But I concur with Glenn. We're a lot further along because of it. And I think this next, just look at this last year, the changes. So I'm pretty encouraged.
We talk a lot about issues around data security, data privacy, and these are unique issues, particularly in healthcare compared to other industries. Have we dealt with that issue adequately? And what are some of the issues we have to think about going forward around these important issues in healthcare?
Yeah, I think I think it's an ongoing process, David. When we converted from paper to electronic, the ability to actually do audits and find out where we were having problems in security, both inside out and outside in, kind of shocked us. And we were undoubtedly having the same problems, if not more problems, when we were way back in the paper era. We just couldn't audit it. We didn't know what was going on. So I think, that was one important aspect. The second aspect is, there's kind of a different trade-off now in terms of functionality versus security. And I think we're getting to the point where we actually expect both. But early on, we found that a huge number of our patients in particular were willing to have more functionality and to have a little bit less security. I don't think that's the case now. I think we've moved along in technology as well as in culture, where we don't have to trade one off for the other.
Jim, I know that when we were talking about before we started this webinar, the issue of security. Is it a technology issue? Is it a human issue? And we're going to get into this discussion in this webinar around cloud. Why don't you share a little bit of your thoughts about the issue of data security?
Yeah, well, I think privacy is kind of the way to frame it for a patient consumer. What do I share that I don't want other people to know? And the doctor-patient relationship always had that kind of secure space. And once you added, the digital partner, that sanctity of that relationship changed forever. Because I'm not sure what security means exactly. I would say at Microsoft, it's probably a key pillar that differentiates us. And I think, working with Innovaccer has been a real pleasure because of the values we place on privacy and security for our customer or our patients as physicians. And so I was mentioning to you and Glenn before the call started that I think human security is going to be the next big space, because when I talk about that, I'm talking about human security as relates to viruses like COVID. And as we screen for cybersecurity today from outside threats, from what we think is traditional security threats from foreign nations, I think we're going to have human security issues from viruses. And how do we start to detect and know those things upstream, which I think we can do. And so the whole data privacy issue to me has now evolved into an ethical, difficult set of solutions that now we're relying on a digital set of partners to control, that I hope we can maintain the trust in. And again, I'm biased towards Microsoft because I'm employed by them. But Satya Nadella is very clear. We do not use somebody else's data. It is not our information to share, use, or assess. It's our customers' data, their customers' data, and that is sacred and sacrosanct.
Now, that's a great point. This is one of the issues that really makes healthcare a different industry than other industries when we talk about these technologies. Let's take a fast forward to today. So we talked about the HITECH Act. We got some things done, but not really the promise. Then we've had this pandemic, and it really has had an impact, I think, in terms of what we learned about the ability to deliver digital care. And then I think it's changed expectations as well, particularly of consumers. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I guess, to me, I think we've jumped 5 to 7 years in this past year. If you look at the telecommunications world, the percentage of calls are up 30%. If you look at telemedicine as you have, it's the same, at least 30%. Phone calls are lasting 30% longer. People have been less mobile, 60% less mobile because of lockdowns and other things because of this. So we've actually had to, as a society, adjust. I don't think we're going to go back to where we were. And then is 5G going to change that even more? But the thing I worry most about is half the world, 3+ billion people, has no access to what we're talking about. So I think there's some real important issues around access and equity. And it's not just the United States. But I think technology will play a major role in both or all of those areas.
You know, Glenn, you've worked with us here at Innovator, and you remember when the pandemic hit, we were a little concerned about, geez, you know, what impact will this pandemic have? I think you've seen the same acceleration that Jim just talked about.
Well, let me just comment on two things that Jim said. First of all, the access issue is a real issue, but you know, in many parts of the world, the physical access issue is even worse. So in a way, and this may be a bit Pollyannish, I think that solving, you know, the electronic access issue may actually even come ahead of solving the physical issue. That's certainly the case in rural parts of the United States, particularly if, you know, if as a part of our look at infrastructure, we talk about getting internet access and 5G access throughout the entire country, rural as well as inner city. The other thing which is really important here is the regulatory aspects. And, you know, people tend to do what they get paid for. And if there's a huge delta between, you know, what you get reimbursed if you're physically interacting with a patient versus electronically or virtually, guess what happens? And I think COVID has been a catalyst to really help mitigate some of the rigidity in the regulations here. And I think when you look at all the innovation that's going on out there, that innovation is being responsive to changes in regulatory as well as changes in culture. So you know, at City of Hope, where I happen to be associated in the not-for-profit part of my life, as Jim said, I mean, we went from 25% virtual up to over 50%, almost 60% for our non-acute care. And I suspect that that's going to continue, and that will have a real impact on how we plan our capital expenditures over the next 5 to 10 years. And a part of that is, you know, is not only the changed expectation on the part of the patients and their families, but part of it is some regulatory changes and regulatory, I think, responses to COVID that will continue. And that's all good. And by the way, it's not either or. I mean, any good provider organization is going to want to give the human beings that they're responsible for an option, whether it's virtual or physical interaction. And there will be a need for both, and they will have to be equally accessible. So it's not either or.
Yeah, so it sounds like a lot of acceleration, a lot of new experiences, when we'll come up with somewhere in between coming out of this. So that makes a lot of sense. You know, Jim, I'd like to come back to you. You know, in the landscape where I've seen in healthcare, there's a lot of concerns around, as we get into this issue of digital transformation and the idea of moving to the cloud. A lot of investments have been made. What have you seen as some of the barriers to organizations being resistant or struggling or having questions about this concept of moving to the cloud and in this overall idea of digital transformation as an enterprise?
Yeah, I think it's like COVID in some ways. People don't understand what the transformation is. And so you mentioned privacy, security. Health systems are always afraid of losing control of their patient data for, you know, obvious reasons. And I think they're starting to also value that data as actually having some value to the organization potentially. And of course, there's a cost. dollars and cents. And many people made this huge investment, as you were talking about, like electronic health records. And the advantages Glenn and I spoke to are great, but it's also been a burden for some of the practitioners to actually have to interface with all these tools while they're trying to talk to patients. And so our recent acquisition of Nuance allows for us to think of how we can change some of that with ambulatory clinical intelligence and artificial intelligence to take what this natural progression of electronic health records into more automated ways so the doctor can actually talk and examine the patient and not be typing all the time. But I think the cost, the lack of understanding of the potential savings, so the early investment for the return on investment, things like security, like on-premise backup versus not backup, cost of energy, updating the software, all this can be done in the cloud so much more efficiently and less costly. And the cloud runs when it runs and it's off when it's not used, whereas virtual machines on premises are running all the time. So it's a very different thought process. And then, as you well know, you and Glenn are experts in this, that connectivity across the different areas of healthcare, payers, providers, pharmacy, supply chain, all that is on disparate systems and don't talk to each other, makes it really complicated to manage these things. So I think the cloud is here to stay. It's a tough decision for people who don't understand, and it's an expense with margins going down for healthcare systems. So there's a real challenge, but I think the transition is happening.
Hey, David, let me ask Jim a question. First of all, I think if organizations like Microsoft that have the capability of customizing, how the data is stored and how it can be used by a client, if there's a commitment not to have a secondary or a tertiary business model with that data, that's absolutely critical, because a lot of organizations are just very, very suspicious of having the data monetized once it's turned over. And that's a big deal. And that goes slightly beyond the issue of security and what have you. The other issue is if when I was at Geisinger, we spent a huge amount of money, and it was obviously a much earlier time, creating a data warehouse, and the capabilities of combining what we could analyze out of our claims side and what we could analyze out of our provider caregiving side was really the sweet spot for all the innovation that we did. But right now, if what I'm hearing from you is what I think I'm hearing, would we even need a data warehouse?
Yeah. So the short answer is no. We can create a data lake for you in the cloud that's yours, that we don't want access to, that actually from a compliance standpoint will be much easier to monitor who's been in it and out of it, and track that for you in an automated way. And I think the one thing Glenn, you did so well at Geisinger was mixing the plan with clinical practice. And so you could, as you just said, you could take those data sets with longitudinality with the claims and the patient and actually start to develop the predictive models everybody's today talking about in a big way. You were doing that a long time ago. And I think it's that thought process that you get credit for starting in many ways, I think has been really helpful for people like Microsoft to say, look, we need to provide this to everybody. And in fact, I think if I was running a health system with you today, and we did some of this, we could have partnered with much bigger data sets, had much more generalizable population-based data,
Sure.
and probably done better predictive modeling for the country, quite frankly. And here we have COVID, where we have all these disconnected systems that couldn't provide any information, and still, quite frankly, is not doing a good job.
Yeah.
So this whole digital infrastructure for our country, let alone any health system, is essential to the future.
Well, the other thing, David, that is a certain limitation in people moving to the cloud is this proprietary versus non-proprietary. There are a lot of great institutions out there that have either healthcare provision institutions or payer institutions, quite frankly, that have a huge amount of data. And there are no clear-cut rules yet and no consensus as to how much of that data should be common utility data and in an anonymized way used by anyone who wants to use it to improve caregiving or payment for caregiving, and how much should remain proprietary. I mean, obviously, there's got to be enough proprietary there to motivate innovation and what have you. But that's another societal discussion that that is to some extent limiting right now.
Yeah, I think, Glenn, this is really an important point for the future. I think there needs to be a public utility part of this transformation, and that utility would have been essential in COVID.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely.
You can turn that on or turn it off, maintain your privacy data lake, but one of my colleagues uses the builder's analogy. So you need lumber and you need nails, and there's these building codes. And I think the government should be providing the codes for us in digital transformation, but let the private markets build those things to the code so that when we have to share data, the code says, this interoperability, we can actually share apples with apples and hopefully take care of the country almost immediately instead of 18 months later.
Sure.
And so I think this public utility notion, I've written about this as the Federal Reserve of Health. The Federal Reserve in early 1900s came to be because of a financial crisis that banking decided to have sort of a utility of sharing data for our whole banking industry. The healthcare industry should be able to do the same thing.
This is a great discussion, and I think it really brings up a lot of the questions that people are wrestling with. 2 points I'd just like to make here. I'd like to check in with the audience, because I think you just brought up this issue of digital transformation, Jim. Let's ask them kind of where they're at, a year plus into the pandemic. So I'm going to ask the audience two things here, and then come back to this discussion. First, let's take this poll, go into the chat box, and please answer where do you think your organization is currently in the process of digital transformation? You've got 5 choices here, ranging from you don't know where to start to you're all set and you're already transformed. So let's get a sense where the audience is. And also, this has been such a great discussion so far. If you have additional questions, please put them into the chat box and we'll track them throughout and weave them into this conversation. But let's go back to this issue while we're taking this poll, Jim and Glenn. This issue of public utility and security and privacy is so important in healthcare for patients. Where do you think enterprises are going to be wrestling with this? What do you think people are going to answer for this poll? Where do you think people are in the environment today in terms of wrestling with these questions?
Yeah, I've seen these polls, as you have, quite a few times, and most of them say they're already starting to transform to the cloud. I would say that's probably not true. I would say probably less than 20% of health providers, systems, payers have transformed. The payers are transforming a bit faster. It's understanding what, and you asked this question, kind of what does this mean? What are the barriers? I talk to a lot of the systems around the country and around the world. I don't think they understand the infrastructure needs they have to have in digital transformation to achieve all the things they actually want to innovate to do. So we talk about it H1, H2, H3. So, kind of lift and shifting your current infrastructure to a digital format, updating your current technology, and then innovating in H3. And I think if you don't make the commitment to transform the infrastructure, it's going to be hard for you to stay up to date and provide your patients with the best care. So it's as expensive as it is, and I'm not in sales, I'm in research. I think it's really important that we start to have this discussion as you are today to think about how to do this.
Glenn, here are the results. What do you think?
Yeah, it's pretty much what I expected. I'm not sure if I believe them, but it's pretty much what I expected. The other thing is that we have to think, we actually have to think about a national strategy for digital as well. And that's being discussed. There's a lot of interesting kind of metaphors out there, like we are right now in 2021, probably just the way we were in the early 1950s before the federal interstate highway system was put in, and so a lot of what's happening depends upon what happens in Washington. It depends upon our post-COVID recovery, our economic well-being. It depends upon the usual kind of political trade-offs in terms of how much can get done and what's at the top of the list. But I do think that we are moving towards a national strategy which builds on EHRs but goes way beyond EHRs. And I think what we ought to think about is how each of our organizations in the supply chain, including the delivery systems, what is their sweet spot? And their sweet spot should be, how to effectively improve the interaction with either the patients or the people who will become patients, and leave a lot of the other technology to organizations like Microsoft, who can really develop the storage capacity. They can design that capacity to really do what the individual organizations want to do. They could probably design compliance. If we do have a national digital policy, they could probably design that compliance a hell of a lot better than all of us who are in, various provider organizations. So in a way, it's kind of like assigning sweet spots and then moving to your particular sweet spot. And so that's kind of the way I frame it.
Jim, you talked about Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3, decision makings and commitments that an organization needs to make. Where do you see this heading? Like, why would we do digital transformation? What is the ultimate goal? Where do you think the future of healthcare could look like if we could do what some other industries have done?
Yeah, well, I go back to banking because everybody understands banking, and I like Glenn's analogy of the highway. What I worry about in the highway is we'll create another lane of congestion rather than fixing the problem. So I don't want to add just another lane that just adds to the expense of healthcare, which everybody in this conference is well aware of, that we as a country, a society can't sustain. So, many states are starting to say we're only going to grow at 3% per year in healthcare, and we're going to start to control the spend like Maryland did. And many states are starting to move in that direction. I think the digital transformation, and I echo Glenn's thoughts about a national set of policies, or at least what the coding should be of how these things are built, because we want free enterprise to work, but we have to get to banking or building codes that people can make sure are in compliance with what's going to be successful over time for the population. And, today we're at a very difficult time with racial issues, and we know that African Americans and Hispanics have been hit much harder by COVID. I'm not sure we could have avoided that, but we certainly need to start to think about, as I said, human security going forward. And this digital process that we're talking about has all the abilities to start thinking about that. And just like Glenn said, to bring skip generations and bring some of the broadband to Africa or India, we need to skip some generations to get the equity issues fixed faster. And we need to not have the regulations get in the way. The FDA did a phenomenal job with getting 3 vaccines approved quickly so this country can do it. But the digital infrastructure is hugely lacking in every part of our country, albeit banking is pretty good.
Yeah, and the complexities, David, the complexities of having a federal policy and then having an interface between federal and state, and then even within states having regional complexities. It's not an easy problem to solve, but I think there is a move towards a national digital policy, which will help. And I agree completely with Jim that if we make bad caregiving more efficient, that's not a good outcome. So we always have to think about the ultimate effect on how we as providers care for our patients, quite frankly, or how we as payers incent the correct kind of care. And if we don't think about that kind of end utility and use case, we could develop an extra lane and have more efficient, bad caregiving. So I think we always have to remind ourselves, what is the ultimate benefit going to be in the individual interaction between a caregiver and a care getter, whether it's a virtual or whether it's a physical interaction. Absolutely critical.
No, absolutely. Let me bring this conversation back to where people are dealing with today around this whole issue of infrastructure. So, Glenn, you brought up a great point in the question about, will we need data warehouses? Currently we've had this EMR, it came out of the HITECH Act, and that seems to serve its purpose. We've talked about moving to the cloud, virtualization. Jim, you made some great points about particularly with Horizon 1, moving to the cloud starts to get you in terms of the ability to just use computing purposes when you need it. But a lot of organizations have made incredible investments in a lot of these infrastructure around analytics and data warehouses and the whole vendor of having ETL and moving data from place to place. What does this result in currently in terms of the ability to deliver patient-centered care, that longitudinal journey that you talked about, Jim? What are some of the problems that we're currently seeing, and how can people wrestle with the decision of resolving this? Jim,
look, listen, I think you've got to have some discipline in your thinking here, and again, I would go back to saying caregivers ought to focus on their sweet spot, which is how do they improve in every way the efficiency and the utility and outcome in the caregiving process. They shouldn't be distracted the way we were distracted when I was at Geisinger, by trying to housebreak Epic or trying to build our own data warehouses. I mean, if Microsoft had been around with their incredibly evolving functional data warehouse, if Innovacer had been there, I could have probably redistributed resources that were going to 150 people, that were in IT to do the kinds of stuff that other people should be doing, and we could focus on stuff that was our sweet spot. Now, the guy who was running the IT budget or the girl who was running the IT budget might not have been happy about that. But that, that's the way I would frame the kind of thinking to, to say, what is it we can do best in our particular part of the supply chain, and what now has been developed on the cloud side, as well as on the interface for the point of care side, that we could, take advantage of and not have to do ourselves.
I guess, David, on your slide, you have all these brand names, which are pretty big companies, some of them, and they're all in the healthcare space. They're not all connected. And so the consumer is the one who loses, especially the disadvantaged consumer. That, so people like us three are going to probably be fine because we know the system, we know who to call, and we can get care. But I would say the average person doesn't. And I'm not talking about, the poorest people. I'm talking about the average person who makes a good living. The healthcare system is a mess. And, getting an appointment, making sure I'm getting the best treatment with the best evidence, is CVS and Walgreens talking to my provider? I think Glenn captured this well. We kind of have to stay in our lane, but we have to work across lanes to be successful. And if it's just about money, we're probably all going to fail. If it's about best quality, access, equity, and those are our guiding principles, then we need to stick to those principles in the infrastructure we build to achieve what's best for N equals 1. If we're just out for ourselves, I think we continue down this kind of more stuff. And from the Dartmouth Atlas, as you know, for decades, we said more isn't better. And so I'm convinced, I'm hopeful that COVID has caused us to rethink some of this, but this is still America. And people will take advantage of the economics for what's best for them. That's great, but that's not equity, quality, value, and what's going to be good for our society.
So I think this journey that you just described and the questions that come up from the patient perspective, this is what we have to wrestle with. And we're still going to have these distributed systems, from organizations like pharmacies and labs. We just need to be able to resolve that, because it really is, I think, to your point, the experience that the patient experiences.
Yeah, we have to make that better. So look, it's going to happen. You'll be able to manage your healthcare on your phone for sure, if you have a phone and you have 5G connections, because imaging will be on your phone, labs will be on your phone, decision tools will be on your phone. The stuff we're doing in basic research at Microsoft with T cells, to actually have a single diagnostic blood test that can tell you you're going to get COVID before you even feel sick, or cancer, the world is changing fast. And I worry that the healthcare medical school education can't keep up with it, quite frankly. So figuring out how we rethink education at all levels in our society today is really important. So I'm hoping our leaders of society are figuring out what we need to do and how do we transition in a safe, effective way to get there, because it's not going to take 5 years. Just as 5 to 7 years or 10 years since we've had the High Tech Act, a lot's happened and people are still behind in that space. So we've got a lot of work to do, but I think it's never been more exciting. And if Glenn and I were still CEOs, I'm confident that we would have figured out how to work together to do something for the betterment of those people we represented. I'm hoping that's the case today.
Well, we did work together, Jim. Don't you remember?
Yeah, I forgot.
But I think your point is a good one, that patients seek care from many different organizations. Everybody's going to have their EHR. That seems to work, to do the purpose it was set out to do. And they're going to visit their pharmacy, and they're going to have telehealth, and they're going to have other vendors that are sort of innovating to perform other data sources. The issue is getting to the health cloud to really have those experiences be seamless and to learn from them. And
Yeah, but
also,
even what you guys do at Interface, getting data normalized to be able to take that mishmash of stuff and make it useful in the cloud is critical. So your function as a company have got a nice niche of actually taking this disparate, complicated information, making sense of it so that we can actually analyze apples to apples.
It also, Innovacer is kind of between the cloud and the analytics and the actual point of care. And obviously my sweet spot has always been to try to figure out how to use the information, how to present the information in a usable way so that it affects behavior change at the point of care. Behavior change both on the part of the provider, but also on the part of the care getter. I mean, one of the great things that we've shown now over the last 20, 25 years is that electronics really, the electronic and the virtual interface actually kind of emancipates the care getter to be a much more active participant in the relationship. A perfect example of that is hypertension control. I mean, in the old days when you try to control hypertension by seeing your doc or your nurse practitioner once a year, that had the expected outcome. But now with a continuing interface, and then a once a year visit to talk about whether you should get a PSA or not, I mean, you've got a lot better chance of having optimized blood pressure control, no question about that. And there are lots of other examples as well.
And just to pick up on that, because I think it's an important point in today's society, who actually enables the person. And in disparate communities, it could be the church. It could be the YMCA. So let's not leave the non-traditional health systems out of this ecosystem that actually will transform who gets better hypertensive care or cardiac care or COVID vaccinations.
Exactly.
So we need to broaden this ecosystem to be all inclusive of the best possible people to operationalize it, which is not always the health systems.
yeah, and I think that earlier slide with the future of healthcare really spoke to that. And we experience this now with our phones. We have private, we can accept and make available our data on our phone to various applications to a variety of different organizations, or we can go into Amazon and purchase securely and privately from a variety of different retail store, or organizations who have different suppliers. So we've done this in other industries, and I think you brought up the issue of the ecosystem in healthcare. It's very well said. Let's just check in with our audience once more and say, a lot of this discussion about digital transformation really leverages a moving to the cloud. I think your point of Horizon 1, getting that asset into the cloud, making sense of that data, which we do closely with you and Microsoft here at Innovacer, and then being able to allow people to start innovating Horizon 3 on top of that data. It really is about the data. Let's see what's driving people's interest in the cloud today, because I think this is a learning experience for many people. And I think, Jim, you've talked about the issue of while we're waiting for these results, some people don't understand what the cloud is and why would they move to the cloud? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a computer scientist. I'm a surgeon who became a techie, so I'm still learning. But I think the way I think about it, which might be helpful for people, is your laptop computer has about a terabyte of data, and just imagine that you had 10 million computers in front of you that you could put information in and have it analyzed as fast as you can, make a PowerPoint slide. The ability of the cloud is that connectivity of multiple computers working to answer a question rapidly. And so give you some specific examples. For COVID, one of the issues was, what are the binding sites for the antibodies for which a treatment could be effective. And so protein folding, which actually allows you to see the inner workings of a virus and its DNA coding, would allow you to understand where those surfaces are. And so with high GPU capacity of a place like Microsoft, something that would take years to figure out can now take days to weeks. So because of the capabilities of computing and the algorithms to actually start to understand what our cellular biological functions are doing before they did it, you know, sort of the decoding of our DNA or RNA, we can actually start to develop actual treatments much more rapidly, like Pfizer, Moderna, et cetera, have done. mRNA wasn't a new thing. It's been around for a while. The question is, how did you actually make it into something that could be accepted in the body, wouldn't be rejected, cause a bad effect, et cetera. So high-speed computing, the cloud, allows you to do so many more calculations that humans could never do in any real way. So 5G functions faster than our brains do. So the good news, bad news is it's fast. It has, you know, you can secure things in your own environment, but it also is not humanly, you're not humanly able to tell exactly what's happening. So corruption of systems becomes an interesting risk potentially. And so that's why companies like Microsoft or any of the big cloud companies become important, because they have the systems to actually manage these multiple computers, so to speak, all at once. They can figure out what's happening in one place and in a compliance way faster than you can, anybody can. And you can get to what I think patients want, is kind of uniformity of best treatment for me, N equals 1 today for my problem. And that's where I think we're headed. And I'm quite confident in that statement. Just as we are with vaccines, I think we'll say the same thing for cancers, et cetera. So the cloud to me is a bunch of computers working to me, the patient's advantage, if my system, our health system, allows it to do so in a secure way. And back to Glenn's point, that data has to be the patient's and the system's data, not the tech company's data.
So Glenn, here are the results. Interesting.
Yeah, I think it's not only interesting, but I think it's very positive, because the fact of the matter is that digital innovation is an enabler, and without actually thinking about how that enabler fundamentally helps you change your caregiving protocols, it could do more damage than good. So I think, I'm pleased and not surprised, but I'm pleased that this is a response.
And I think the results may have been different before the pandemic. There's so much interest.
Absolutely,
right now.
absolutely,
Unbelievable.
absolutely. And one of the things that Jim mentioned is the ability to have a much quicker kind of and much more robust look at changing virus and what have you. But we are right now in the midst of one of the biggest worldwide experiments that's ever been done in terms of vaccination. And if you look at post-marketing, I mean, one of the great utilities of the cloud, which really could go back decades, is the ability to look at post-marketing data. And let's just think about the J&J clot situation. I mean, unless we have an ability to aggregate data in immense quantities and across a huge number of geographies and markets and even countries, we'll never get a good idea of the incidence of a low probability event like clots with the J&J vaccine. So, I mean, and that can be applied to everything in post-marketing. And if you had much more post-marketing efficiency and interoperability, you could probably make an argument that a lot of the FDA processes could be made much more efficient as we get new breakthrough treatments that are about to go public. So I just, there's so many positive examples of cloud utility.
If you just take Glenn's just last point, which is, I think, really a brilliant comment, the clinical trials world with cloud and connectivity and actually getting to the right populations for your studies can be greatly accelerated. So not only the discovery of new drugs with our AI and machine learning in vivo or in vitro instead of in vivo, but also the ability to get those drugs to market and then do the surveillance, like the clot issues, in a much faster, much more organized digital construct that's better for the world. So there are so many advantages that we as a society, as a global world, have to think about here.
I want to bring up this issue of equity, and there's a lot of discussion around. It's not just about the care that's delivered by physicians, right? There's these social determinants of care. How can the cloud help us here?
Yeah, I think the whole issue of social determinants is quite interesting. If you look at global warming, Bill Gates would say that we have to get rid of 50 billion tons of carbon waste. And if we started today, that would take 30 to 50 years. And if you look at, in his new book, he talks about where the focus should be. And, it's not on electric cars necessarily, but it's manufacturing. And my point is that if we target where our biggest impact in healthcare could be, social determinants is one of those variables, right? And that's why you're asking this question. And so it isn't necessarily cloud or not cloud. It's actually having that kind of population-based information that then says to city planners, if you used to play SimCity or something like that, that actually became a tool that city planners started to use beyond a game to actually make some investments. We talk about these things now, and I'm worried about all the dollars that we're throwing out there without city planning, so to speak, without transformation, which the cloud is doing, but we're also creating greater disparities. So with this homeschooling and not having 5G and not having, the ability to do online learning. So these social issues, to me, will be something that's going to take 10, 20 more years, are not quickly fixed, but it's part of the infrastructure rebuild this country needs to do. And as we do this, the rest of the world hopefully will gain from it. But I think this is the kind of data and impact that has been missing for most of what we've done for healthcare in my lifetime.
No,
Hey, David, let me get a little bit more concrete, because as we all know, and probably most of our webinar listeners know, there's been more and more accountability for responding to SDOH put on provider systems, and that's problematic, but it's probably going to continue. And I also believe that moving from fee-for-service to VBC, or to something that kind of approximates what capitation was back in the 90s, is going to continue. And most of the data for SDOH is not available within the provider systems. It's got to be brought in, and it's got to be brought in from the cloud. And it's got to be brought in and presented in a way that the individual providers, or whoever's in charge of that geographic or market cohort, whether it's Medicaid or whether it's Medicare or whether it's commercial insurance, can actually make a difference and do something. And so, I understand what Jim was saying, and it was kind of the big picture and holistic, but I think we've got a real need to use cloud-based data imported into our provider systems, which are having more and more responsibility put on them for SDOH. Whether it's adequate adequate living space, or whether it's healthy food access, or what have you. And it's got to be made usable for the providers or the provider system in order to make a difference. Otherwise, they're going to get screwed in terms of the VBC and the kind of pseudo capitation for which they're getting paid.
Yeah, absolutely. And this has been a core sweet spot of what we've done at Innovator, as this picture shows, bringing in those social determinants to help unify that data with other sources of data, as we've been talking about. And moving to the cloud on Microsoft has been a key piece of that. So it's not just the provider systems, though, it's other folks. I think this gets to this point of Jim bringing up somewhere between private enterprise use and a public utility. There are other folks, other entities like life sciences to learn and make available clinical trials, the patient to give better control over their data and be able to give that data to whom they choose to. I mean, it's a lot of different stakeholders, and really brings, this idea of the future of healthcare, as we've been discussing. We've had a ton of questions I haven't been able to weave in. I've tried to weave in a few of these. This has been a great discussion. Let me just ask you, particularly thinking about using the cloud to drive this future vision of healthcare, any closing remarks from each of you? Let's start with you, Glenn.
Well, again, I would just, first of all, I'm very positive about what's happening. I hope we don't have a lot of recidivism, regulatory recidivism in particular, after we get through COVID, if and when we get through COVID. I would just say that if in this kind of longitudinal commitment to better care for human beings, whether you're on the payer or the provider side, or the enabling IT side, everybody should look at their own sweet spot. And if they could take all of their energy and focus it on their own sweet spot, with good use case kind of outcome examples that are very compelling, and then be able to delegate to other organizations that are best in class, for what Microsoft does and what Innovator does, that would be the best of all worlds, I think.
Jim, your thoughts, closing thoughts for this webinar?
Yeah, I would say technology will not be rate limiting. I think people and collaboration will be rate limiting. So technology has the ability to answer all the questions we've raised today in partnerships. It's the ability of businesses, the government, private sector, public sector, and others to come together to solve those problems. It's not, the cloud has the capabilities, and data, there couldn't be enough data. We're not worried about that. But the collaboration across the partners you've talked about and Glenn talked about, I think it's all possible today. Yeah.
I think collaboration is the key theme, and that's a great point to end on. I want to thank both of you for participating. You both have been tremendous contributors to our thinking in healthcare across the country. And now that we talk about post-pandemic, moving to the cloud and starting this sort of collaboration and use of data to really drive the future of healthcare, this has been a great discussion and fabulous insights. I want to thank everybody from the participants for joining us today, and just the final round of thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.